Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conversion Conversations. This is Cameron, and today I have a special guest with me, Scott from Vector Sigma. Why don't you say hi?
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. If anyone's, watched any of my videos, I'm sure they already know who you are. They've probably read some of your articles. They've probably checked out plenty of your gameplay videos. But I guess just in terms of your time in Transformers trading card game to start off with some context. You've been here basically from the beginning, right? I things kicked off last year at what, Gen Con last year or San Diego Comic Con or something? And you've been
Yeah,
there since then?
I guess technically the first cards were released and shown at San Diego Comic Con. I was actually on an African safari when that was going on.
Oh, that's awesome.
But from there, I wasn't able to go to Gen Con last year, so I know they had again the convention packs, and then teach you how to play, and then they gave out a common cards to a bunch of people. And from there, I had pretty much been watching some gameplay videos, and I've been looking for another card game to get into, and I really like the IP I have since I was a kid. So watching it and understanding it, not having actually played it, I kind of started just digesting as much of it without physically owning it as possible. And then my friend, my teammate John Palmer, who was able to go to Gen Con, got me brought back a couple starters and some other cards. So we started playing just to test it out, and then I actually launched VectorSigma.info a week before the game came out. Having wrote my first article without even seeing the full set, and I remember the first article I released had to make changes the night before because that was the day Grimlock was released, and I was writing this Dinobot deck without him being spoiled and all this. So I wouldn't say I was here from literally day one, but I guess day 1.5.
It sounds like day negative one. Yeah. Right, if we're considering the launch, yeah.
Yeah, just not day -5, I guess you could say. But
and anyone who's looked at any of your work, they know you as I know you as kind of the competitive voice in the community. There's all sorts of different people putting out cool videos and showing off fun matches, but I think you guys approach it from the most here is the things you need to know to win the game, which I appreciate as a new player. Kind of, I especially appreciate being able to go to your site when I was first starting out and just pull a deck list and be like, okay, I've got these cards. Let me learn to play using this deck. That's been real good. And
yeah, I think what people kind of misunderstand about that, from maybe some of the negative connotation they may put on, is a lot of those videos, especially when they're actual tournament videos, we're just actually trying to get as much out of it for ourselves and find our own mistakes as possible as well. Because we're not going back and let's say we're showing a playtesting video, we're not going back and a lot of times anyway. Sometimes we do it with commentary, but we're not going back and editing out bad plays and things like that.
Right, which I think it helps people learn. The fact that you, especially some of the videos where you do have post commentary, I think is great when you go back and you discuss, okay, here, had I had a little more time to make a decision or whatever the circumstances were, I actually probably this might have been the helpful decision, which helps new players definitely think through what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be gained for consistently playing decks that either you've played in the past, whether at an event or whether during testing, and then refining them, as opposed to okay, tomorrow I'm going to pick up something different, the next day I'm going to pick up something different. You may miss things, but it's kind of mental shortcuts where you're just playing the decks that are most refined. And I have to be honest, I think a reason we play a lot of quote meta decks is because I think we helped create a lot of those meta decks. So
right.
It's kind of chicken or egg argument type of thing. So we all have full-time jobs. We all have other things going on. So when we play and when we play test, it's usually in tournament settings.
Yep.
So or preparing for a tournament setting. So we're just showing you our entire process. We just don't have time to have a different process, to be honest with you. I guess the most casual we've been is probably when we filmed a bunch of stuff at day one when Wave 2 released, and completely raw stuff from there. But in general, we just don't have a lot of time to put into those kind of things. So
right.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, because you mentioned that you were looking for a new trading card game, I guess for anyone who's seen the channel before, the team in general, I think this was no one's first trading card game at Vector Sigma, right? Everyone's played some stuff previously before.
Correct, at different varying levels, yeah. Dan and I played. Dan Arnold and I were on a World of Warcraft trading card game team together for years. John Palmer and I have been like best friends since high school. I met Mark through Transformers, and then Vince and I go back to World of Warcraft as well. But that necessarily wasn't everybody's first game either.
Right.
I mean, I've been playing trading card games since 1994. I started playing Magic during Antiquities.
Oh wow, yeah. So I dabbled a little bit during like Onslaught, but that's about it.
Yeah, Onslaught was like late for me, so that's how old I am. So like I played in the first Pro Tour, and like I've been playing card games at a competitive level since 1995 or 96, I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And played Magic until the World of Warcraft card game came out, which was probably at this point I want to say like 15 years ago. Played that its entire run. I was the head strategy writer for the main site for that, so like I actually like was employed by Blizzard or by Cryptozoic, like whoever was actually running it at the time.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then when Hearthstone came out, they killed the physical card game.
Right.
So from there, I kind of didn't play card games for a bit, and then I started playing a couple FFG games. Like I played the Game of Thrones game, and I played for like maybe a year, and then I played Star Wars Destiny when that came out for about a year. Game of Thrones did not fit my style at all. It's a very complicated game. Star Wars Destiny is a good game. It's just that FFG proved to just not be a company that I really wanted to support from an organized play perspective. So even though I had pretty good success, like top 80 in the first U.S. Nationals, top 80 in a couple other events, like the game just didn't hold a lot of like interest for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I heard about Transformers with my, how much I like the IP and things like that, it kind of just went from there. And when I knew Wizards was supporting it, and I knew, like I've had experience in the past in licensed games, but knowing the relationship between Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, which I'm still not 100% sure how it actually works, despite talking to the team many times, I knew that the licensing issue was not going to be an issue like it has been in other games in the past. Like they don't have to run. I mean, they run things by them, but they don't have to like, I don't know. They don't have to run like, oh, we want to ban this card. Like I have to go contact the company and have like a bunch of meetings about it and stuff like that. Like it seems to me like the Wizards aspect is allowed to control the card game cards. Maybe not like the characters that are on the cards and things like that as much as possible without having to like cross every T and dot every I. There are a decent amount of crossing and T's and dotting I's, but it's nothing compared to like working with, like I've worked with Blizzard in the past and with Lucasfilm in the past.
Yeah.
Like it's nothing compared to them.
So then I guess real quick before we dive into our main topic, you said something interesting that I wanted to follow up on. So you said when Hearthstone came out, they killed the physical card game. And I know right now we're seeing a lot of like, there's all sorts of digital card games. Are you someone that just prefers playing on paper? Like if there was a Transformers TCG app there is the app, but if the app was also a functional version of the game, would you play that at all, or you stick to the cards in hand?
I mean, at this point, I would probably play the game, but like I've dabbled in online card games. I won't play Hearthstone because it killed WoW, but like I've played. Have you ever heard of like Shadowverse?
Yes.
And like Gwent and a couple other digital card games I have dabbled in a little bit. Honestly, like I would play Transformers if it became a digital card game. I'm so all in at this point. It's kind of impossible not to. But to be honest with you, and I played like Magic the Gathering online when it was still Moto, not when it's been Arena or whatever it is now.
Right.
What I like about physical card games over digital ones is I feel like digital card games get solved very easily, especially ones that have like restrictive deck building requirements like Hearthstone or like Shadowverse, things like that. Like it amazed me like when I played Shadowverse when it first came out, like a week in to a new set being released, like, oh, here's all the top decks, and here's the decks that like all these top players are playing, and I'm like, geez, how did you like assess this like so quickly? And like, because there's just so much data that's out there and available to the public that it almost becomes not necessarily 100% about play skill. It becomes just about like a complicated rock paper scissors matrix.
Plus,
Because
there's things like you don't miss triggers in a digital game, I assume, right? Like the computer kind of handles stuff like that for you, whereas some of the human mistakes that we need to learn to avoid on paper get taken care of for us digitally.
right, there's just not as much. There's not as much back and forth in gameplay. It's really more about like, here's my matchup for A and here's my matchup for B, and A always beats B unless something really, really out of control happens. And like, this is what I've heard anyway, like at the really high levels. That's why they have certain rules, like you show up to a tournament, you bring 5 decks, and your opponent can tell you can only run 3 of them and things like that, because it's so like rock, paper, scissors like that. I mean, more complicated than that, that you actually have to take those advantages away from the player, and that just doesn't suit me as well as like having to sit down, figure things out, play through it. This game has extremely complicated like turn-based mechanics, Transformers, and it's very dependent on play skill more so than a lot of these other games. I'm not saying there's not skill, obviously, in playing like Hearthstone or Shadowverse or any of these games. I guess I find personally like the deck building aspects to be really interesting, and the deck theory aspects be interesting. And then I just find in digital card games that gets solved for you, and you almost can't go any other direction than what the millions of people have already, thousands of people have already figured out in like a week. So, it's just different.
Yeah. And actually, that's a great segue because you mentioned deck building. And that's kind of the goal of this conversation is so like we've said, I'm a relatively new player to TCGs. I've played Transformers. I've played decks that I've found online. I've, tweaked them a little bit to my liking. I've built one deck list from scratch, which was my attempt at getting Menasor to work. It's gone through like probably 5 iterations, and I was never really happy with it. But I figured, if I'm struggling with this thing, I'm sure there are other new players who maybe like me, like Transformers, haven't really played a ton of TCGs but want to get into it. And I was thinking maybe we could have a conversation about pitfalls to avoid or strategies to think about when building a deck from scratch, because I've seen that in the community. People love building around their favorite characters, even if it's not necessarily the strongest deck in the world. They're trying to make their favorite characters work. So I figured maybe if we talk about some of the things to think about when building a deck list, it'll help out other new players in trying to build those decks better. I guess starting out, the first question I've got is so for anyone who doesn't happen to know, I think the only rules about Transformers TCG decks are it has to be a minimum of 40 battle cards and a total of 25 stars. And I guess a sub rule of that is you have to have at least one character card, right? Because otherwise you'd lose the game as soon as it starts.
Sure, and three of any card.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yes, and max of 3 of any battle card. I think other games do different numbers, but yeah, max of 3 of any battle card. So I've seen like other deck lists out there where it's like an even mix of like orange and blue and stuff like that. I'm wondering or I've seen decks built around like, here, let me get as much bold and attack as possible, which I get, like you want to knock out your opponent's characters to win the game. I've seen decks designed around dealing direct damage through battle card effects, or decks built around using character card effects to win. I guess the first thing you do when you're thinking up a deck you want to play, is the first thing you have to think of the win condition that you want to, like your route to victory, or is there anything else you think in mind before coming up with that central idea?
So I think Transformers presents a unique way of going about thinking of those things, because you have characters and you have a battle deck. And I'm a strong believer that they need to be synergistic with one another, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to start with one or the other. I've made decks based around certain characters, and I've made decks based around wanting to play certain battle cards. Typically, I will say that there are exceptions to this, but like whatever battle cards, if you start on the battle card side, it usually comes down to what color pip the main cards you're trying to build around are that kind of put you in the direction of whether you're going to be an aggressive deck or whether you're going to be a defensive deck. I've kind of found the decks that go in between just aren't strong enough in the current metagame, just because there aren't enough ways to manipulate your combat step to where you can mathematically assume that you're going to get the right colors at the right time.
Right, and I think, I don't remember if it was you guys that used the term or if I heard it somewhere else, but someone called it divergent flips. It's like if you're too split down the middle, then you can't predict with any reasonable accuracy what your next flip's going to be offensively or defensively to get the effect that you want.
I mean, you can predict anything, but it won't work out in your favor. That's part of the issue. Like, typically when you build decks, you should want to be aiming for, every card you flip counts as one side of whatever you are. So if you're an offensive deck, and you're flipping 2 battle cards outside of having bold or whatever, you should assume that you're basically adding 2 power to your character's attack and vice versa on defense, and then tough and bold and other effects will add from there. Even when you include your whites, your blanks, your doubles, normally the math should work out to where it's still an average. It should be slightly more than an average of like 1.0 per card that you're flipping. And I've built simulators to try to figure that kind of stuff out.
Yeah, I've got like an Excel sheet I've been trying to use to figure out like, okay, if I've got, 3 cards in hand, that leaves 37 cards, on the flip, what's the probability of the first card being an orange or a blue, or that sort of stuff, which I think everyone can use some. I mean, maybe not build a whole simulator, but everyone can use some math to help structure their decks a little more tightly.
Yeah, normally like I'll just put the deck itself into the simulator and then figure out like what the typical flip like density curve is, and then from there, I mean, like I won't do it. I'm not like a poker player. I know how to play, and I'm just not as good as like other people where like I have all the odds memorized at all times. So I don't use. It's hard for me sometimes to take into consideration like what's in my scrap pile, what's in my hand, and take that kind of stuff away. But at least by doing the simulator up front when I first create the deck, I can at least see what I should expect to flip, and then I can kind of look through piles and say, okay, how many doubles do I have left? How many whites do I have left? How many blanks do I have left? And kind of go from there. But honestly, like if you watch enough combat in this game, you will see like, I mean, you could flip 4 cards very easily or 6 cards very easily by having like bold or tough or flipping a white and stuff. But honestly, a lot of times if the deck is built to specs, like you'll still wind up with that same average of like 1 per card. Like I've seen Metroplex decks and things like that are obviously off the curve, but in general, like you're like, oh, I have bold 3, like, and you flip like, blank, white, but then you flip 2 doubles, like it still winds up being right around the 1 per card. So like
Right.
it usually does work out when you play enough games.
So then I guess, right, we've got our central idea for a deck, whether it's based on a character or based on a win condition. Where do you go next? I guess we've been talking about flips a little bit. Do you map out kind of, here's my limits on how much orange I can put in to, let's say, a mostly defensive deck, or how much blue I'm willing to put into a mostly offensive deck? Or do you go somewhere else next and start looking at like battle card effects or things like that?
So I try to build to character strengths if I'm trying to build from the character side. So for example, if a character has typically like 3 or more defense, they're probably going to wind up in a defensive deck because it's just to their advantage to be in a defensive deck with more blues. If a character has high attack or bold or something like that, it's pretty obvious for their star cost anyway. Like if the team does that, they're going to be a more offensive deck. Those rules don't always follow. But when I have diverged from that, I will say like the decks just don't wind up all that well. Like I remember during Wave 1, for example, like, because Dinobots was always losing to Insecticons, I said like, well, what's one of their advantages? Like a lot of them have 2 defense. So let me try to build like a mostly blue Dinobot deck because, Dino Chomp is still going to go in the deck and it's blue. And, I can run Leap into Battle instead of running, Supercharge and things like that. Let me see how this works. And I improved my Bugs matchup, but I hurt a lot of my other matchups. So it just became obvious to me from certain exercises like that like the characters were built with a certain strategy in mind, and deviating from that usually causes you to have a deck that's just not as efficient as what I don't want to say is what the designers intended, but it seems kind of obvious that it is what the designers intended just because of the way that I've found it to work now. I mean, some cards are universal enough where you can run them either way, but in general, like those are some hard and fast rules that I try to follow. But it really just depends on whether you're starting from the character or from the battle card perspective. Like, you know, a good example of that is like what if you look at a typical Cars deck, it's going to start from the I want to run start your engines, I want to run turbo boosters,
Yep.
because I want to have multiple attacks. So getting multiple attacks is different than just getting my attack to be like a zillion, like the way Dinobots runs, or having more efficient attacks than my opponent, like the way Insecticons works. So it's a little bit different in the sense that like I'm basically going to have more attacks than you by untapping my characters, because that's what my battle cards that interact with me do. So normally, like for Cars, for example, it's not just that the cars themselves were powerful. Like I'm a big fan of Wheeljack. I'm a big fan of like the different Bumblebees and things like that. It's more that Start Your Engines was the powerful card. So that's one example where you would start from the battle card perspective. Same thing with Dinobots with Dino Chomp, although they kind of get both sides because you want to build around Grimlock and you want to build around Dino Chomp at the same time. But that's just an example of being able to start from either perspective because they exist together.
Yep. Yeah, and that's been interesting to see kind of some of the tribal tools we've gotten so far. Like I know in my personal play experience, I spent a good chunk of time. I didn't really use my own deck list, but I used some deck lists I found online trying to make like planes work in Wave 1, and I just couldn't seem to put them together in the same way I was able to put a Cars deck together. It seems like there's definitely a lot of judgment that needs to go into, okay, here's the tools I have available, even if I'm trying to make something work competitively. Is there better tools out there that do the same thing, maybe just with different characters I found?
Yeah, some tribes don't have the cards that support them right now, so you just wind up building generic aggro deck, generic defensive deck, and sometimes without those tribal cards anchoring it, it's just not as efficient as you could do it with when, you know, your Dinobot deck will get extra cards in it, your Insecticon deck will get extra cards in it, your, you know, if the plane and tank decks just cards aren't as efficient and aren't moving you in the same direction. So, you know, what can you do?
Right. I guess actually I have one thing I skipped over on my list of questions that I think I know the answer to, but I figure maybe it's good, especially if this is more beginner oriented. Would you ever play more than 40 cards in a battle deck?
No, it doesn't make mathematical sense.
Right, because if you're limited to 3 of your your best card you probably are running 3 of if it's that good. If you're adding one card in 41, 3 over 41 is a smaller chance to pull it than 3 over 40.
Correct.
Is there?
It's not just that; it's also the battle conditions as well. Like, I guess the battle fifth sometimes won't make that much of a difference when you have redundancy, but it certainly makes a difference in what you actually draw.
When you say battle conditions, what do you mean?
Like the battle flips. Like if you just run another orange, phase. It might not make that much of a difference, but it certainly does in the sense of like what you're going to draw.
In terms of, because we've talked about a couple different types of decks, the way I've viewed it, you know, personally, is everything's kind of a variation of orange aggro decks, right? Trying to swing and deal damage as quickly as possible, whether through extra turns or by having big, tough characters that can swing really hard. Or there's blue decks that are trying to do something that's not aggro. Would you, in your head, do you split them up any further than those two general ideas? Or would you say like there are X number of archetypes of deck lists that exist in Transformers?
So that's a complicated question and an article I've been trying to figure out how to write for a long time now. Like it's not a rock, paper, scissors. It's very much like at the minimum, like a 6x6 grid as to how the format actually interacts with itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking so. So what's your X and Y axis in that situation? You gotta put a legend on this plot.
It's basically just like the same decks against each other, like the way the metagame shape. So
Oh,
it's like
gotcha,
you would just
gotcha. So you're
so
you're
like where
ranking
they
each
inter-
individual matchup.
yeah, it would be your percentage chances in each individual matchup.
Hmm.
And I like let's just take six for example. I don't even think three of them would be orange and three of them would be blue, for example. I just think that the way it what's actually interesting about this game, because there's only so many colors and directions that you can go, because I don't like, to me, like green is not a combat color, it just helps you do other things, even like when black comes in,
Right,
and certainly white, like they don't.
black without
Yeah,
orange or blue wouldn't do a whole lot.
right, so you can't build around the other colors, so it really just comes down to like which of your two like primary colors, for lack of a better term, are you building around. And at that point, the decks operate differently, even if you had the same exact battle deck, which you never should, with the characters. Like, uh, a deck like Predacons running orange will be different than a deck running Insecticons, will be different than a deck running Cars, will be different than a deck running Dinobots, all running versions of the same orange deck, just because of how the numbers of characters, the powers on the characters all interact. And what also is really good about the game is some of the characters are so unique in what they do and how they interact with the board that the entire matchup swings on them having one of four or one of five characters, like in a combiner team or something like that. And, you know, access to be able to attack that character or how that works can sometimes swing like how an entire game works. I know it seems odd, but that really is how it breaks down. Like you can be favored in one orange matchup and be unfavorable in another, just based on like having different stats on the characters, different abilities on the characters. Because for example, a Dinobot is harder to kill in single combat than an Insecticon is. So, for example, like in Wave One, like Optimus Prime based Battlefield Legend based decks struggled against Dinobots at times because they had three giant dudes to deal with versus four smaller guys to deal with
Right, where you can
Insecticons.
almost pop an Insecticon per attack.
Right. So it became like a race as to whether or not you could kill them before they could kill you. Whereas like the Dinobots, if you needed more than one attack, they could just kill you right back.
Yeah, that's
So
actually that's a really good point. I wasn't thinking of it that way, but right in my mind right now, the three orange decks that I have played against and with the most would be Sentinels, Dinobots, and Insecticons. And all three, you're right, all three are, I mean, they're essentially dealing damage, but they're all doing it in a different way. Sentinels has a lot of hand disruption, kind of taking away your opponent's tools as you're playing. Insecticons have these big swings, but they're these fragile creatures. And then Dinobots, they get their big swings also, but there's a little more durability there, and they're not as wide.
yeah, agreed. And then it's surprisingly different despite the similarities in the battle decks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I haven't played or seen Devastator a ton, but I guess he could be thrown in there too. But they're weird, suicidal kamikaze guys.
Yes.
So I guess you mentioned it briefly. You said kind of this is something that or maybe I misinterpreted. Is this something that is unique to Transformers in terms of how structured things are around a character? I haven't played the other TCGs like I know Magic, right? Magic, you build a deck, but it's not built around a character. Is this something that's new to kind of the TCG genre?
Sort of, but not exactly. So, Star Wars Destiny is a card / dice game which is based around certain characters. That's similar to it, but what actually happens there is that like what you can put in your deck is actually fully dictated by the colors of your characters, so that like your characters determine what you can even play to begin with.
It's
so
like a mana pool, kind of like a commander deck or whatever.
Yeah, it's like exactly. Think of it. Yeah, that's a good example. Like the colors on your commander dictate what you can play in your commander deck in Magic. It's the same exact thing. So like the colors of the characters you actually play determine the colors you can actually play in your deck itself. So aside from that, like I would say the universality of being able to do whatever you want is it unique, at least in what I've played in card games. I'm not familiar with 100% of the ones that are out there, but it's unique for me in games I've played. Like even when I played WoW, you had like a hero that could be attacked and everything like that, interacted with, but that also determined the cards you could put in your deck as well.
Based on like class or something.
Yeah.
Yep.
Class, race, all that kind of stuff. So faction, like things like that. Whereas this is completely wide open. There's obviously certain cards you want to play.
Yeah, you don't want to put Null Rays of Starscream in a Megatron deck.
Right. But there aren't that many cards that don't allow that.
Right. It's only, I can think of like a handful.
Right. Like, Ion Blaster Prime can't be put on somebody else, but you could play Swarm in a non-Insecticon deck and won't do a whole heck of a lot, but you could, so you could play Ion Blaster too. It just won't do much. But,
and I actually originally, when I started playing, I got that rule wrong back when swap parts was legal, before they gave out the first FAQ. I thought the whole point of swap parts was to be able to put Ion Blaster of Optimus on him and then give it to another character that way. I didn't realize that wasn't what you were supposed to do.
No, what you're supposed to do is break the rules of the game and take 45 minutes to sit around doing nothing. So that's what it wound up being in the end. But yeah. But so yeah, I mean, for me in games I've played, it's unique in that aspect. Where the deck building is more just without the deck building doesn't force you to have a resource based system. So there's no lands, there's no resource points, there's no anything like that. So you're not restricted by that. This is the first game I've played personally. I know other people have played others that have this limitation as to how many what I call actions. I know the cards are called actions as well, but I always call them action phases that you can actually take in a turn.
Yeah, that's the resource versus another card that you have to access.
Right. So I've never played a game like that. I've always played games that are, trying to get a resource advantage on your opponent or make the most efficient use out of your resources. But it's different here, which I would say one thing, if you're new to coming in the game, is that makes a huge difference on how you build decks. Because to me personally, I think I'm on record saying I think things like card advantage are overrated in this game compared to playing the exact card you want to play every single turn, because you only have so much time in a game, because your characters are going to get knocked out. You're going to lose turns as the game goes on. So you want to make sure that for the at various points in the game, you're playing the most efficient things you possibly can. And yes, drawing a bunch of cards will allow you to make a better informed decision, but playing the best card at all times will simply allow you to do that more efficiently. So, I think people that come from other games that are more resource system based see things like card draw and are immediately thinking, those must be the best cards in the game, and they help. And they're, at this point, in my opinion, they're necessary evils, because there's just not a lot of things that are better. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best way to go. It is in certain decks, but in others, it's just a necessary evil right now.
Yeah, I think that's one of the pitfalls I fell into with my Menasor deck list that I was trying to put together. Was I was so focused on okay, I'm going to get 2 extra actions. I combine, I'll get 2 extra actions. Let me try and take as much advantage of getting the stuff I need to use those 2 extra actions. I wasn't thinking about okay, but for the first, 4 or 5 turns before I actually get Menasor out there, I'm limited to, 1 action, 1 upgrade. How do I utilize those as best as possible? What
honestly, for me, I actually find that the cards that give you extra actions during that phase are also can be overrated as well. I mean, there are certain ones that I really like Field Communicator, but I'm on record saying I'm not a huge fan of Brainstorm, for example, because it just puts too much pressure on your hand. There aren't a lot of situations where the game isn't built to do all these things in one turn. It's are you does it really matter if you're playing 3 bit of battles in the same turn? You really need to do that? Probably not. It just doesn't do a whole lot. You'll knock out one character and then you won't have any more cards left in your hand. It's just not something you typically, quote, need to do. The game wasn't built on that axiom. So like, I think you can wind up being inefficient by playing a lot of those cards as well.
And that's actually a really good point. When you said like the you're kind of limited. There's certain special rules that help you either get damage out across other characters through direct damage or the steamroll battle card or Grimlock's ability. But like in most cases, right, you could pile up a ton of damage, but it'll still probably only kill one person. Is there, I guess, if someone's putting together their first deck, is there let's say, for example, it's an aggro deck. Would you say that as they're putting things together, is there too much stack up damage that they could plan for? Like if they're trying to shoot for getting, 25 damage swings each turn versus doing something else, how do they make that sort of decision?
I guess it depends on what you have to figure out, like what your matchups are, and what you build your deck to, I guess, take advantage of as best as possible. You should typically assume for an aggressive deck, for example, like any character that swings, you want to be playing as best as possible a weapon that's going to give them +3 for that turn,
Mm-hmm.
and an action that's going to be giving them anywhere from +3 to +4. Like that's your goal. So you want to be adding 6 power plus your combat flips. And like if you play like a bold weapon, that would count as the same thing. Like I'm not going to add extra flips to that. So like you typically want to be going as best as possible, like +8 on a turn that you can actually play both take advantage of with action phases. So past turn 2 of the game, you want to be able to be getting any character at +8 attack over whatever they have on their base card, and then obviously like bold would add to that, or abilities like kickback would have to be factored in separately. But typically, you want to be looking at +8, and on the defensive side, it's harder because you actually have to play. As it stands now, secret actions will change this probably, but you actually have to play upgrades on the characters to typically make their defense better than what they start at. But typically, you want to be gaining like anywhere from 2 to 3 defense on top of whatever your base defense is. So I don't really look at it in terms of how much are you doing in one attack. What's most important is how many turns and how many attacks does it take you to actually knock out your opponent. Like everything is in base of how many turns it takes you and how many actions it takes you to take care of your opponent, because you always have to attack every single turn.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's how many of your overall, and I mean overall turns, like you're playing your action, playing your upgrade, and attacking, does it take for you to knock out certain guys? And if you can get, every time you get that number decreased by 1, so when you're actually saving a turn into how many turns it fully takes you to kill a guy, that's where you start to build the advantage on the aggro deck perspective. And every time you can prevent your opponent from doing that, that's where the advantage comes in on the defensive side. Like for example, if you think of current like aerial bot lists, right? So Fireflight is 1 attack, 7 hit points, 2 defense with Brave. Every attack that he soaks up from the opponent beyond the first, like especially the first, like if he as long as he doesn't get one shot, you're ahead, because you have 5 characters and they typically have less.
Right.
If they have the same number, then you're probably surviving even more attacks because they're having all their guys have low attack.
Yep. And they have to hit that defense multiple times.
Right. So every attack past the first that it takes to kill a character like that, you're way ahead because you have more characters to act with. So I tend to look at things as number of turns that it takes for each side to do what they're trying to do, or prevent, in the case of a defensive deck, like prevent their opponent from doing something, is a more important factor than that. But in terms of deck building, you want to make sure you're playing as many cards in your deck to then shave off turns or add turns if you're playing a defensive deck, for example, as best as possible. Or a defensive deck still needs to actually do damage to win. So that's where cards like Bigger They Are, Heavy Handed, Leap into Battle, like they're still blue cards and they still add to combat. So,
yep.
And like, a lot of the blue weapons, while there's less of them that are efficient, they're still, Energon Axe to me is still the best weapon in the game. It's blue, not orange. So you still have to find ways of doing damage, but it's not as cut and dry as it is an orange deck, which basically just needs to be able to attack as efficiently as possible at all times, which actually puts a tremendous amount of pressure on your hand to have exactly what you need at all times with every single guy that you attack with, because anytime it takes you more than one attack to do something, you're at a disadvantage.
Right.
So that's where that comes into play.
And you've mentioned this concept, hand advantage or hand pressure. Like I've taken that just to mean how many cards you burn up to do a particular thing, because the less cards you have generally, right, the less options you're going to have on the next turn. Is there any more nuance to that?
No, it's playing the right things at the right time, and in this game, because you start with such a smaller hand size than compared to other games, you just need to make sure that you're not wasting those actions phases, like wasting your upgrade for the turn or wasting your action for the turn when you don't need it. So there are certain characters like if you're attacking with like a Sentinel Prowl, for example, and your opponent has a guy with like 3 hit points and 1 armor left, like you probably don't need to play your action or your upgrade for the turn in order to knock him out. So just save those cards in your hand, because you'll probably need them for when your less efficient attackers actually have to attack somebody that's larger. So this is where the cat and mouse game of like attack orders and target selection and things like that come into play, but we don't have time to go into all that.
Right. That's more of a play than a deck list type conversation.
But if you understand those things, if you understand like target selection and attack orders and things, that'll influence how you build your deck as well. Because I think one thing that I just want to mention is when I typically build a deck, I'm trying to find redundancy in the actions and upgrades that I'm using. So like if I'm building an orange deck, I'm going to want to play as many of the 3 attack weapons as I can that stay in play as best as possible. If that doesn't exist in the format like it didn't in Wave 1, there's other options that you might need to go with. But I typically try to find as much redundancy as possible. So like I'm going to play Reckless Charge and Supercharge. I might not play 3 of each, but I'm going to make sure I have like 4 to 5 to 6 total actions that basically redundantly give me +3 to +4 attack as best as possible. And as more cards are printed, that's only going to increase.
Right. Same thing with like on the upgrades, right? There's Erratic Lightning and there's other orange weapons that can give you that that attack value that you're looking for.
Right. And I've run the math of like one of the first article I ever wrote was like a comparison between in an orange based deck running Flamethrower versus Power Sword, and it wound up that Flamethrower was better. Because the blue pips that you were flipping at times were on offense actually hurt you by playing 3 of them over the other 3. So there are certain things you need to look at in that as well. Like the color of the pip does matter in certain calls like that. But I think we've probably seen most people accept that over time. They didn't accept it earlier, and now there's just so many more options that's not even really even a factor, honestly, much anymore. Like, but you have to watch out for certain scenarios like that.
Is there, I guess, and I'm sure it depends deck on deck, because that's, I think, what I've been learning through this conversation is due to the unique mechanics in the Transformers TCG, everything is very deck situational. Is there a way to judge the value of a marginal attack +1? Like, let's say you've got 2 weapons, 2 generic weapons. One gives you +2, one gives you +3, but gives you -1 defense. Would you play the one that gives you +3 -1 every time in an aggro deck, or is there a situation where you say, actually, that 1 defense on my character matters?
It's complicated. The first combat simulator I actually ever created attempted to do that, but the factors became so varied that it was, because again, you're looking at the number of turns that it takes for your guy to survive or to KO the opposition.
Right, the turns you were talking about earlier in terms of how fast you can kill versus how many turns you get before you're done.
Yeah. In an aggro deck, I don't think it matters much because typically your combat flips don't really help you on defense unless you run a lot of dual pip cards and things like that. So in that situation, I don't think it's as big of a deal. And vice versa on the defensive side. Like some of the in between decks, it can matter. Like for example, I feel like one of Dinobot's strengths in when you're playing an aggro on aggro, assuming the Dinobot deck is an aggressive deck, is their 2 defense. So giving them an erratic lightning, if it's not Grimlock, can hurt them because you're taking away one of their strengths. I don't think it matters once you start getting like lower in the defense, like having 1 defense versus 0, like really doesn't matter. But it can matter to me in aggro and aggro, like when you hit that 2 number, because typically, like if you think of Grimlock, for example, with 12 health and 2 defense, it's very difficult to one-shot him, even for other aggressive decks. So if he has 1 defense, yes, that's only like 1 complete, like effective hit points. It's called like it's a term from like online computer games and stuff. But his effective health would only go down by 1, but like the number of attacks it might take to kill him may go from 3 to 2, and that's where it would be a negative. But that doesn't typically happen all that often. It's very corner case where that would make a difference versus the massive nature of a +3 attack, if that makes sense. I know it's not an answer because it's hard. It's hard to sit down and actually figure it out. It typically comes into play with guys that have like 10 hit points and 2 defense. Like it's not usually the guys that are on the extremes. It's like Starter Optimus Prime. It's who else? Like it's like Ironhide and Sentinels. Like these are characters that you want them. Like one of their strengths is having the 2 defense,
right?
Not necessarily just having more attack. So
like you said, if someone's swinging 6 at you or 5 at you each turn, the 2 defense helps you buy basically another turn of life. What I get in terms of, I'm trying to think. So I think you've helped out a lot in terms of trying to structure my next deck list idea, especially going into wave 3 and what I'm thinking of in terms of what I want to build. Is there, I guess, any core concepts of the basic deck building ideas that I might have not touched on here?
I guess one big thing for me, and I think the rest of the community has grown to accept this over time, is like, I don't care what the pip color is on a card if it fits into the deck archetype. Like, I don't care if it's blank. I don't care if it's orange in a blue deck. To a certain extent, like, I have no hard and fast rule as to how many, quote, off-color or blank cards I'm going to run. But I look at the power level of the battle card itself more than I look at the color on the card, unless there's a direct comparison. Like, I try to avoid, for example, like, there are exceptions to this, but like running Energon Axe in an aggressive deck, if possible. But I'm not gonna not run Start Your Engines in a card deck that's aggressive because it's blue. Right. I'm not gonna not run Dino Chomp in my Dinobots decks because it's blue. But if there is a direct comparison, like, and this is what, as we start to get more and more cards, this will obviously happen more often. Like, Erratic Lightning allowed me to not have to play Energon Axe in orange decks. It also allowed me not to play Flamethrower in orange decks as well if you don't want to. So there are some direct upgrades because as we get more cards that you're going to find. But I guess the big thing for me is like I certainly don't shy away from cards like One Shall Stand, One Shall Fall, or Plasma Burst, or cards that are blank but have such varied use. Obviously I still function like I think the most powerful battle cards in the game are blank outside of upgrades. So like I don't shy away from the color on the card. And I think what you'll find in other deck lists is that they might be running like literally like 36 to 37 on color cards, and my typical decks are like 29, 30, because the value of the blanks or the off color cards in my hand when I actually play them have a greater value to me when playing than the combat flips, because a certain percentage of the time, and I won't get into all the math, like you're going to draw that card and it's going to have a greater advantage than like when the number of times that you flip it. So you're not really playing a card game if we're just playing war. Like, you got to play good cards. So
Right. No, that's a really good point. I know. I think in my mind, I've got kind of a rough balance of where I'd like to be on any deck, but that's a good point. That it might be okay to be. It is okay to be a little more flexible on that if the value of that card is strong enough.
unless you can find a direct comparison, like across cards, like
If we get an orange
our,
leap in a battle equivalent at some point or something.
which we have now, like like I don't like like reckless charge is a huge example. Like I put reckless charge in every single one of my orange decks. For example, I see other people not doing that because I guess they care about the 3 damage that their guy takes, which means virtually nothing to me. It doesn't change that whole turn combat math thing for me. But in wave 1, there was no orange leap in a battle outside of supercharge.
Yep.
Which should act like that if your deck is built correctly.
Yep.
Whereas now, to me, orange has more of the advantage on the combat side with having reckless charge, supercharge. Those are pretty much the staples. So even though, and I guess press the advantage if you're an Autobot deck, or have Autobots in your deck, I should say. But on the flip side, like it wasn't that way in wave 1, and I think some people may just be like stuck in that mentality if they're still going that route. But if you can find a slightly less powerful on color card, you should usually go with it. But it doesn't mean that like there aren't necessarily always going to be the equivalents on both sides. Like, you're not going to find, like, I'm not going to run Testify in my orange decks because they don't have a pep talk, for example, or I'm not going to run, but you may find it in other colors. Like, if you want to run Disruptive Entrance in your orange decks, you can just run Espionage now. Like, there are more options that are coming out, and things like that. And green changes a lot of this as well. But there are usually options you can find, quote, in color, or at least in white or in blank, that'll give you what you're looking for without having to necessarily completely upend yourself from the color perspective.
I'm trying to think if I've got anything else for you. Oh, actually, yeah. One last thing, especially because it's been something I've been thinking about, basically since Wave 2 when we got Noble's Blaster and Scoundrel's Blaster. I do you feel in the current kind of metagame state, and then looking into Wave 3, is there still, especially with combiner teams, is there still a place for the mixed faction decks? I know I've taken a shot at a couple of them myself, just playing around, but I from what I've seen, in the larger community, not so much locally, but in the larger community, it seems like some of the strong cards we've gotten that are faction specific have really encouraged. Like, for example, you mentioned combat commands. Like, that, I think, heavily encourages, if you've got 2 Autobots and you're looking for a third card, try and make it an Autobot? Or would you say there's Flame War can go in for 5 stars even if it costs you your combat commands, sort of thing?
You mean press the advantage?
Or sorry, press the advantage.
Yeah,
combat commands is the one for Sentinels, right?
Sentinel. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's again, I'm a little more aggressive with my deck building than other people. Like, I will play specialist base cards with 1 specialist in my deck. I will play ranged cards with 1 ranged character in my deck, depending on how important they are to the strategy. Like, I'm not a type of person like that's going to have to is forced to play multiple characters that necessarily interact with the combat cards if they're individually powerful and they make sense in the deck. You just have to know that they're going to be, quote, dead cards, like, after the fact. Or like if that character gets knocked out, or and that can be like, and you can kind of control that through the flow of the game. And like, if you have those cards in your hand, you don't necessarily have to be as aggressive in getting those characters out on the battlefield to be attacked as early as necessary. So like, there's ways to control that, I would say, which again, I think this is something that a lot of people are fearful of, and I'm certainly not fearful of. But yeah, again, I tend to look at the stats and the abilities on the characters if it makes sense. Some of the tribes make sense to all stick together. Like again, like a lot of the Insecticon cards are powerful when you're playing an all Insecticon deck. Obviously, the combiner teams can't really be run very efficiently outside of themselves. If you want to, I mean, you can run combiner pieces in other decks, but typically the combiner deck itself can't run other options. It's not like they're Scramble City combiners or anything like that. Take an arm from Menasor and a leg from Superion and make your own combiner or anything like that. So, so I guess the short answer is yes. Like, again, it's similar to the battle cards. Like, I will look at a character in isolation as to how powerful they are. I thought going into Wave 2, the cards like Confidence and Swindled were going to make a big difference, that I wanted to run my decks like solely in that faction. And I think in the very, very beginning, I built a lot of decks with them. Then they proved to be overvalued by me, because just playing extra things in a turn just wound up not being as important. And now I've kind of even swung back at times to start playing them again. So it kind of depends, again, like as to what that synergy is with your battle deck and with your characters. But for, I've created decks with like Grimlock as my only Dinobot, and I'm still running Dino Chomp. So, and he could be with 2 Decepticons. Like, that doesn't matter to me, especially in the sense of certain green cards like Press the Advantage, or like the various blasters and things like that. Like, if they're green and I can get them out of my deck pretty easily, like I can run one character and it's fine. I think that was a long answer too. Yes, I look at the character's ability, and that's more important than like anything else on them. But
no,
I mean,
but I think that context is definitely helpful. I know I'm definitely of the mind, at least in my starting out, I've definitely been of the mind that like, okay, if I'm going to play this card, I want to have at least half my team be able to use it in case someone gets knocked out, because I'm always paranoid about like, the dead cards pulling up in my hand after the team's gone.
I think the game has changed to where that isn't as important anymore with like the advent of green or cards like Swindled and Confidence and things like that. I think has allowed changes in that the way that is. And I've been playing cards since like Inspiring Leadership since like the game began, to avoid those situations. Like I don't necessarily have to go out of my way to run those cards, but if they make sense, like I'm not saying like I'm gonna build a deck with like one specialist, one ranged guy, one melee guy, and I'm gonna play like
right,
everything, like
each one.
Right. But that could happen, honestly. Like I mean, I would have to have a lot of
card effects were strong enough.
Right. Yep. Exactly. So like, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but it helps to have redundancy, just from like I always have a place to play my cards, but it's not as important as like power to like the cards in this game are singularly powerful enough to try to get around that instead of playing less powerful cards. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, I think that hopefully that's some good, helpful advice for everyone else who's kind of trying the game out for the first time, especially with Wave 3 coming out soon. Hopefully with organized play, we see kind of an influx of players. I know you guys probably in New Jersey have the biggest competitive scene, I think, in terms of local access.
Well, I'm west of Philadelphia. I've never lived in New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
Whoa,
okay.
He's there. The tournaments that I usually go to are in New Jersey. So it is the like Philadelphia, Southeast New Jersey scene.
Yeah. But then I guess in terms of things to think about when we're deck building, especially for new players, I know one thing I'm struggling with right now, that the part that they just announced is sideboarding, which I know it was a thing in Magic, but I never really was a competitive Magic player. I just try to play a fun Goblin deck as much as I could. Is there, I guess, the idea for sideboarding in my mentality is, and I'm hoping for maybe some correction if I'm wrong here. For example, let's say I'm playing Sentinels. I know that I have a rough matchup against Insecticons, is my sideboard, does that exist to put the 10 cards in there that can help me turn that Insecticon match around, or is there something else I should be thinking about?
If you know your matchups well enough, I would say that's a good place to start. I don't really know yet because like the format hasn't even started yet, so I don't feel comfortable even fully discussing it yet because I don't really know that those options exist most times yet. Because I'm not really sure I'm not sure how much of Wave 1 and Wave 2 was built with that in mind.
Whereas that's true. Maybe more of a Wave 3 thing.
Yeah, they're on record as saying that Wave 3 was with these tournament rules in mind. So I think we may typically see more of it going forward as opposed to like with the way it looks now. And I like honestly, like the rule just came out last week, so I'm not at a point yet where I feel like I even know enough to be able to discuss it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that is a good point. I guess any parting wisdom for anyone who might be listening?
No, I mean, I guess hopefully this shows that like people that don't know me, like I'm pretty open to discussing these type of things with people that have questions about them. Just I get a lot of questions about them, so you can hit me up on Facebook if you have questions about it. Check out the website. There's a lot of articles. There's a lot of weekly podcasts.
Yeah, I mean, and you guys are pretty accept. There's vectorsigma.info. There's YouTube /vectorsigma.
Vector Sigma info, all one word, yeah.
Oh yeah, YouTube /Vector Sigma info. If anyone hasn't seen, you guys have a Patreon up recently, and part of that is a Discord where people can have direct access to you guys. So that's definitely worth checking out. And then yeah, Facebook. You guys seem to be. I forget where we first started talking. It might have actually been Twitter.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, yeah.
But yeah, so you guys are accessible everywhere. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking me through some of these ideas as I'm trying to figure out, especially as I'm going into Origins, trying to figure out what I want to do. I think this has been very, very helpful.
Yeah, it'll be great to see physically, and I can hopefully show some of these things, in person in case some of the things are a little complicated, and we can walk through with actual examples, like with physical cards. So.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man.
Anytime.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a good one.
Okay, thanks so much again for Scott for joining me for that discussion. And now it's time to do the giveaway. So if you haven't done or been as part of one of my giveaways on the channel before, I tend to do them a lot because I like to Marie Kondo it. I don't like to keep a lot of stuff on hand if I don't use it. So I've got all the comments here asking for the giveaway. So everyone here, I've added to this list of 34 entrants here. I don't normally normally I say all of them, but it's a lot of names, so I'm just going to scroll through. So there should be everyone who wanted to enter the giveaway, and now we will see what the winner is. And that is, again, for this box right here. And if you are the winner and I'm shipping domestically, just contact me and give me the address I need to ship it to. If it needs to ship internationally, I'm able to put, $20 up for shipping. If you're willing to, meet me for the rest of that shipping value, then I can ship it to you, no problem. But yeah, reach out to me via Twitter, Discord, YouTube, however you need to get me the information for whoever does win this thing. So, random between 1 and again, we've got 34 entries. All right, 3, 2, 1, 24. 24 is Mr. Kwong Owong. Mr. Kwong Owong, if you reach out to me, you won. Reach out to me however you can. Let me know how best to get this box to you. It is now yours. And again, thanks everyone for watching and for your support. And I'll probably be doing another one of these eventually because I just have a lot of booster packs and booster boxes that I've got so much stuff, guys. I've got so much stuff. I got to get rid of some of it. All right. Thanks again. Have a great day.